This is the Franklin's tale and the Franklin's prologue. The squire began an elaborate fairy tale, but before he was done, the Franklin interrupted. "My word," he said, "you've done well for yourself. I admire your cleverness. Considering how young you are, you speak with a good deal of feeling. I judge that no one here will equal you in eloquence as you grow older. Good luck to you. By the Trinity, I'd rather have my son as wise as you than receive a gift of land worth 20 pounds. What's the use of a man if it isn't virtuous? I've scolded my son because he doesn't lean toward sensible behavior. He likes to gamble with dice and spending and losing all he has. He'd rather talk with a servant than spend time with a well-born person from whom he might learn good manners." "A straw for manners," said our host. "By goodness, Franklin, you know that each of us has sworn to tell at least a tale or two." "I know that perfectly well, sir," said the Franklin, "but don't mock me because I have a word or two to say to this man." "Tell your tale, then, without any more fuss." "I'll obey you gladly, sir host. I won't contradict your judgment. I pray God that what I say will please you, and if it does, I'll know it's good enough." The Franklin's beard was white as a daisy, and his complexion was ruddy. He liked bread soaked in wine for breakfast. He was in the habit of enjoying life. He was a rich man, and as hospitable as St. Julian. His bread, his ale, his wine were the best anywhere. His house was never without pies stuffed with fish and meat. That place was so full of good things to eat that it seemed to snow meat and drink. He changed his menu according to the season. He kept fat partridges in a coop, and stocked his stream with bream and pike. His cook was in a lot of trouble if the sauce wasn't tasty or the carvers were unprepared. He kept his table set all day long. A dagger and a milk-white silk pouch hung from his belt. He'd been sheriff and accountant of the county. Nowhere was there a more substantial landowner. "In Brittany," the Franklin said, "they composed poems about adventures and sang them accompanied by instruments, or else read them for pleasure. I remember one, which I'll be happy to tell you. But, gentlemen, I beg you to excuse my clumsy speech, because I'm not an educated man. I never learned literary style. Whatever I say, I must say plain. But if it pleases you, you'll hear my tale. In Brittany there lived a knight who loved a lady. He did many a noble deed for her sake before he won her. She was the most beautiful woman under the sun, and of such high birth that the knight scarcely dared to tell her the pain and sorrow he suffered for her love. But at last, because he was so honourable and respectful, she took pity on him and married him, permitting him to rule her as men rule their wives. To make their lives happier, he, of his own free will, swore on his honour as a knight that never in all his life would he dominate her against her will, or show her any jealousy. He would obey her and follow her in everything, as a lover should his lady. He would appear to retain control only for the sake of his rank. Humbly she thanked him. "Sir," she said, "so generous is it of you to offer me so much freedom that neither God nor I will ever be guilty of allowing conflict, war, or strife to come between us. Here is my promise. I will be your true wife until I die." So they were both satisfied. One thing, gentlemen, I can safely say. Friends must obey each other if they want to stay together for a long time. Love can't be restrained by domination. When one person tries to rule the other, love flies out the window. Love is as free as a spirit. Women naturally want liberty. They don't want to be tied down like slaves, and neither, to tell the truth, do men. The one who is most patient in love has the advantage. Scholars tell us patience is a great virtue because it conquers when strictness fails. One shouldn't complain about every little thing. Learn forbearance, or else I assure you, you'll learn it whether you want to or not. There's no one in the world who doesn't upon occasion say or do something wrong. Anger, illness, the stars, wine, sorrow, or a changing disposition can cause mistakes in deed or speech. One can't take revenge for each little error. Everyone with any self-control learns to restrain himself according to the situation. Therefore this wise and worthy knight promised tolerance, so he and his wife might live comfortably together. She for her part, swore that he would never find any fault with her. Here we can see a sensible agreement. She acquired a servant and a master, a servant in love and a master in marriage. He was both master and servant, but mostly master, since he had his beloved for his wife. And when his happiness was assured, he took his wife home to his own country, where they lived in delight and comfort. Only he who has been happily married can know the joy and prosperity that can exist between a husband and a wife. This delightful life lasted for more than a year, until the knight, whose name was Aurelius, decided to spend a year or two in England, earning praise and honor in battle. The book I read said he lived there 2 years. Now I shall leave Aurelius and speak of Dorigen, his wife. She sighed and wept over his absence, as noble women will do if they feel like it. She mourned, wailed, fasted, and lamented. She missed him so much that she counted the rest of the world as nothing. Her friends tried night and day to comfort her. They lectured her, saying she was killing herself for no reason. They made every effort to lighten her spirits. As everyone knows, if you chip away at a stone long enough, eventually you'll carve an image. They comforted her for so long that finally her great sorrow lessened. She couldn't have survived forever in such violent grief. Besides, Aurelius sent home letters saying that he was well and would return soon. Otherwise her sorrow would have killed her. Her friends saw her sadness ease a little and begged her, on their knees, to drive away her dark thoughts by coming out with them. Realizing that it was for the best, she finally agreed. Her castle stood next to the sea, and for amusement she often walked with her friends on a cliff from which she could see many ships and barges sailing on their way. But the sight became part of her sorrow. "Among so many ships," she often said, "is there not one that will bring my lord home? Then my heart would be cured of this bitter agony." Other times she'd sit on the edge of the cliff, thinking. But when she looked down at the frightening black rocks, her heart would shiver so from fear that she could hardly stand up. She'd seat herself on the grass, looking piteously into the sea, and she would sigh, "Eternal God, who rules the world with justice and order, men say you make nothing without a reason. But Lord, those fiendish rocks seem to be the work of chaos, rather than the creation of a perfect, wise, unchanging God. What is their use? South, north, west, east, they feed no bird, man, or beast. These rocks have slain 100,000 men. When you created men in your image, you seemed to love them very much. So how can it be that you have made these destructive rocks that do men no good, only harm? God, who made the wind blow, protect my Lord. I wish you would sink all these black rocks into the sea for his sake." Her friends saw that it was not a pleasure, but a pain for her to walk by the sea. They looked for entertainment elsewhere. They led her by rivers and wells and other delightful places. They danced and played chess and backgammon. One morning they took her to a nearby garden, where they had prepared food and drink. It was the 6th of May. The gentle showers of spring had painted the garden full of leaves and flowers, while skilful hands had arranged it all so artfully that it seemed like paradise. The smell and sight of the flowers would have lightened the heart of any person ever born, except one distressed by too much sickness and sorrow. After dinner everyone danced and sang, except Dorigen. She wept because among the dancers she couldn't see the one man who was both her husband and her love. But she had to stay there a while, hoping that her sorrow would lessen. Dancing with the others was a lively squire, all dressed up like the garden in May. He sang and danced better than any man. He was strong, virtuous, rich, intelligent, and loved by everyone. Unknown to Dorigen, this gallant squire, Aurelius, the servant of Venus, had for 2 or more years loved her better than any other creature. He had never dared tell her of his own grief. His love was hopeless. He could express it a little in a general way, in poems or songs that spoke of sorrow. He must die, he said, like Echo, who dared not speak of her love for Narcissus. He couldn't betray his feelings in any other way, except that now and then while dancing he might look in her face, like a man asking for a favor. But she didn't know what he meant. Nevertheless, because he was her neighbour, and a respectable man whom she had known for a long time, before the party broke up, they spoke to each other. When he saw his chance, Aurelius said, "Madam, by God, who made this world, I wish that the day your Avergus went overseas I had gone to a place from which I would never come back. I know my worship of you is hopeless. My reward is only a broken heart. Madam, have pity on my great pain. With a word you can slay or save me. I wish to God I were buried at your feet. I have no time to say more. Have mercy, beloved, or you will kill me."
"Do you really mean this?" she said. "I had no idea. But, Aurelius, now that I'm aware of your intentions, I tell you, by God who gave me soul and life, I will never be untrue to my husband in word or deed. That is my final answer." But then she added, as a joke, "Aurelius, since I see you lament so pitifully, I will be your love. Whenever you remove from the coast of Brittany, stone by stone, all the rocks that prevent the ships from passing, when you've made the coast so clean of rocks that not a single pebble can be seen, I promise that in every way I will love you best of all."
"Can you not be more merciful than that?"
he said. "No, by the Lord that made me," she said, "I know very well it'll never happen. Put such foolish ideas out of your mind. What pleasure is it for a man to love another man's wife?"
Aurelius sighed and answered, "Madam, I must die a sudden, horrible death."
With those words he turned away.
Knowing nothing of this conversation, their friends wandered up and down the garden paths, enjoying themselves all over again, until the sun paled and the horizon robbed it of its light. That is to say, it was night. They all went home happily, except Aurelius. He returned to his house with a heavy heart, sure that he couldn't escape death. He felt his heart turn cold. He held up his hands to heaven, fell down on his knees, and said his prayers. He was out of his head with sorrow and didn't know what he was saying. He prayed first to the sun. "Apollo," he said, "God and ruler of every plant and herb and tree and flower, cast your merciful eye on wretched, forlorn Aurelius. Lord, though I am innocent, my lady has sworn my death. In your graciousness, have some pity upon my dying heart. Except for my lady, I know that you, if you want to, can help me best. Your blessed sister Diana is queen of the sea. She is brought to life by your fire, and so she follows you. Just so the sea wishes naturally to follow her. Therefore, Lord Apollo, this is my request. Make a miracle, or my heart will break. Beg Diana to bring a tide that will rise at least 5 fathoms above the highest rock in Brittany, and let this tide last for 2 years. Then I can say to my lady, 'Keep your promise, the rocks have disappeared.' Lord Apollo, do this miracle for me, or else beg your sister to sink every rock under the ground to the dark region where Pluto lives, or I will never live to win my lady." With these words he fainted and lay in a trance for some time. His brother, who knew of his sorrow, carried him to bed. "I'll leave this tormented creature lying there. It doesn't matter to me whether he lives or dies." Avergus, the flower of all chivalry, had come home with all his worthy men, in good health and with great honour. Dorigen was in heaven now, that she held in her arms her gallant husband, this bold knight who loved her better than life. It never occurred to him that any man had spoken to her of love while he was away. He didn't think about such things, but danced, jousted, and made her happy. I leave them living in joy and contentment to return to sick. Wretched Aurelius lay in torment for more than 2 years without setting foot out of bed. His only comfort all this time was his brother, a scholar, who knew about his trouble. The scholar dared say nothing about the matter to anyone else, but he carried it secretly in his heart. He wept privately, until at last he remembered that when he was studying at Orleans in France, he saw a book about magic that a fellow student who was supposed to be reading law had hidden in his desk. This book spoke much of foolish things that aren't worth a fly, because the faith of the Holy Church in our creed allows no such illusion to harm us. When he remembered this book, his heart danced with joy, and he said to himself, "My brother will be cured soon, because I'm sure there are tricks these magicians can use to create apparitions. I've heard that at feasts they've made water and a boat appear and then rowed up and down the hall. Sometimes a fierce lion seemed to materialize, or flowers spring up in the meadow. Sometimes a castle of mortar and stone.
Then, when they want to, the magicians make it all disappear again. If I could find some old friend at Orleans who knows magic, perhaps he could arrange for my brother to win his love. These scholars might be able to make it seem to human eyes that all the black rocks of Brittany have disappeared. Then my brother would be cured of his grief, and she would have to keep her promise or be shamed.
To make a long story short, the scholar came to his brother's bed. The squire was so comforted that he jumped up and started for Orleans immediately. When they came close to the city, they met a young scholar roaming about by himself. He greeted them politely in Latin, and then he said a wonderful thing. "I know why you're here." Before they took another step, he told them what they had in mind. The scholar from Brittany asked about friends he'd known in the old days. He wept when he heard they were all dead. Aurelius dismounted from his horse and went home with the magician, who entertained him royally. Aurelius had never seen such a house. Before they went to supper, the magician showed him forests full of wild deer, with the longest horns ever seen by human eyes. He saw 100 slain by hounds or bleeding from bitter wounds inflicted by arrows. When these wild deer disappeared, he saw falconers who'd killed a river heron with their hawks. He saw knights jousting in a field. After this, as a great favour, the magician showed Aurelius himself dancing with his lady. And when the master, who had created this magic, saw it was getting late, he clapped his hands, and goodbye, the whole performance disappeared. They'd never stepped out of the house while looking at these miraculous sights, but sat alone and quiet in the magician's study among all the books. The master called his servant and said, "Is our supper ready? It is almost an hour since I went into the study with this gentleman, and I told you to prepare it." "Sir," said the servant, "it's ready whenever you want it, even if you want to try it now." "It's best that we eat, then," he said. "Even these lovers have to relax sometimes." After supper they talked about the magician's fee for removing all the rocks in Brittany. He drove a hard bargain. He swore he wouldn't take less than 1,000 pounds, and he said he wasn't too willing to do it even for that amount. Aurelius said, "What's 1,000 pounds? If I were lord of the world, I'd give it all to you. We are agreed, the bargain is struck. I give my word, you shall be paid. But let's not, out of laziness, stay here more than another day." "No," said the scholar, "I promise." Aurelius went to bed and slept well. His hope of happiness eased the pain in his sad heart. In the morning, Aurelius and the magician travelled to Brittany, where they remained. The books remind me that this took place in the cold, frosty month of December. The sun was old and pale. The bitter frost, sleet, and rain had destroyed the greenery in every garden. Old Janus, the two-faced god, sat by the fire and drank wine from a great ox horn. The meat of a roasted boar stood before him, and every cheerful soul cried, "Noel." Aurelius did everything he could to make the sorcerer feel welcome. He begged the magician to work hard to end his pain, or he would slit his own heart with a sword. The magician pitied the man so much that he watched night and day for the right time to cast the spell that would make Dorigen and every other person say that the rocks of Brittany had gone away or sunk underground. At last the moment came for his tricks and skullduggery. He knew all the rituals and evil practices used in those pagan days. He waited no longer. Because of his magic, for a week or two it seemed that all the rocks had disappeared. Aurelius, still desperate about whether or not he would win his love, had waited day and night for this miracle. When he realized that every one of the rocks was gone and there was no further obstacle in his way, he fell down at the sorcerer's feet and said, "I thank you, Lord, and you, my Lady Venus, who have helped me out of my troubles." He went to the temple where he knew he would encounter his lady. When he saw his moment, he greeted his beloved humbly with a trembling heart. "My own true lady," he said, "whom I fear and love, the last thing in the world I want to do is upset you. But I am so ill from love of you that I will die right here at your feet, though I am innocent. But even if you feel no pity at my death, think carefully before you go back on your word. Madam, you know very well what you vowed, not that I claim anything of you except your mercy. But in a nearby garden, you know what you promised me. You took my hand and swore to love me best. God knows you said it, even though I am not worthy. Madam, right now I am thinking more of your honor than I am of my own life. I have done as you commanded. If you wish, you can go look. Do as you like. You will find me alive or dead in that garden. Remember your promise. It is in your power whether I live or die, but I know the rocks have disappeared." He went away, and she stood like a stone, not a drop of blood in her face. She had never thought she would be caught in this trap.
"Alas," she said, "that this should happen! I never imagined the possibility of such a monstrous marvel. It's against nature."
Home she went, a broken creature, so afraid she was scarcely able to walk. It was pitiful to see her weeping, wailing, and fainting for 2 whole days. She didn't tell anyone what had happened, for Avergus was out of town. With pale face and sorrowful expression, she complained only to herself.
"I curse fortune," she said, "who unaware has wrapped me in a chain I can only escape through death or dishonour. I must choose one or the other. I would rather lose my life than know myself to be false, or my name besmirched. With my death I am free. Many noble wives and many maidens throughout history have killed themselves rather than sin this way." For 2 days she lamented, planning to die. At last, upon the 3rd night, the noble knight Avergus came home and asked her why she was weeping so miserably. She began to weep even more. "A pity," she said, "that I was ever born. This I have said, this I have sworn."
And she told him all that you've heard. I don't have to tell it to you again. In a cheerful, friendly way, her husband said, "Is there anything else, Dorigen?"
"No, no," she said. "God help me, this is too much, even if it is God's will."
"Wife," he said, "let sleeping dogs lie. Perhaps it may yet be well. You shall keep your word by my faith. God have mercy on me. I would rather be stabbed for the love I have for you than see you fail to keep your oath. A promise must be kept." But as he said that, he burst into tears. "I forbid you," he said, "on pain of death to tell anyone what's happened. As best I can, I'll bear my sorrow. I won't walk around with a long face so that people suspect or judge you." He called a squire and a maidservant. "Go with Dorigen," he said, "and bring her whatever she says." They left, but didn't know why. He didn't tell anyone the reason. You may think him a wicked man to place his wife in danger. Listen to the story before you weep for her. She may have better luck than you think, and after you've heard the tale you can pass judgment. That squire, Aurelius, who was so passionate about Dorigen, happened to meet her on the busiest street in the middle of town as she was on her way to the garden, as she had promised. He was on his way to the garden too, because he spied on all her movements and knew when she left her house. Whether they met by chance or God's purpose, he greeted her gladly and asked her to where she was going. She answered, half out of her mind,
To the garden, to keep my promise, as my husband ordered."
Aurelius considered the situation. He felt great pity in his heart for her and her misery, and for Avergus, the chivalrous knight who was so unwilling for her to break her word, that he had told her to do as she had promised. His heart was touched. He decided it was better all around to remain unsatisfied than to act against the rules of courtly behaviour. Briefly he said, "Madam, tell this to Lord Avergus. I see his great kindness to you, and also I know your misery. In his compassion he would rather be shamed than have you break your promise to me. I would prefer to suffer forever than to come between the two of you. Madam, I release you from your promise. I return into your hand every vow you made since you were born. I swear I will never reproach you about any promise. I take my leave of the best and truest wife I have ever known." Let every wife remember Dorigen, and be careful what she swears. Now you see that a squire can be as generous and noble as a knight. She thanked him on her bare knees, and, rushing home to her husband, told him all you heard me say. Why should I make this story longer? It's enough to say he was well satisfied, you can be sure. Avergus and his wife Dorigen lived happily together for the rest of their lives. Never again was there any anger between them. He cherished her as though she were a queen, and she was true to him forever. You won't get anything more about those two from me. Having lost all his money, Aurelius cursed the day he was born. "What a pity," he said, "that I promised that philosopher 1,000 pounds of gold. What shall I do? I see that I'm doomed. I shall have to sell my property and become a beggar. I can't stay here shaming all my relatives, unless the magician shows me some mercy. Perhaps I can offer to pay him off in installments. If he'll allow that, I'll thank him for his kindness and keep my promise." With a heavy heart he went to his strong box and took out 500 pounds of gold, which he brought to the philosopher, begging him for time to pay the remainder. "Master," he said, "I can boast that I've never failed to keep my word. I'll repay my debt to you, even if it means I must go begging in nothing but my undershirt. But I must ask you to accept my security and give me 2 or 3 years to pay off the rest, or else I'll have to sell my inheritance. There's nothing more to say." When he heard those words, the philosopher answered sternly, "Didn't I keep my end of the bargain?" "Certainly, well and truly."
"Didn't you get the woman you wanted?"
No, no, the squire said, sighing.
"Why? Tell me if you can."
Aurelius told him all you've heard me say before. It's not necessary to repeat it. He said, "Generous Avergus would rather die in sorrow and distress than allow his wife to go back on her word." He told him about Dorigen's sorrow too, and how she would rather die than prove an unfaithful wife, and said she had given her promise in ignorance, never having heard what magic could do. "I felt so sorry for her that as freely as she sent her to me, I sent her back to him again. That's the sum total. There is no more." The philosopher replied, "Dear brother, you all behave generously to one another. You're a squire, he's a knight. God forbid that a scholar can't be as generous as either of you. Sir, I release you from your debt of 1,000 pounds, as if you just this moment crept out of a hole in the ground, never having seen me before. I won't take a penny from you for all my skill and effort. You've paid my living expenses. It was enough. Farewell, and good day." The scholar mounted his horse and went on his way. Gentlemen, this is the question I would ask you. Who do you think was the most generous? Tell me before we go any farther. I know no more. My story is done.